Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Outliers YouTube channel and our program, Criminal Mischief, the Art and Science of Crime Fiction. I'm your host, DP Lyle, and I'm here with my itinerant co-host, Dr. Katherine Ramsland, forensic psychologist. Always fun to be in the same room, so to speak.
Thank you. I'm
And
happy to be here, Doug.
and we have a fascinating guest today, Dr. Jeffrey Smalldon, also in the forensic psychology arena. Jeff, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Doug. Glad to be here.
Well, let's start. Where do you live now? You
Columbus, Ohio.
okay,
Yeah, I
Columbus.
was
All right.
right. Yeah.
Okay, yeah. Catherine thought that was the case. So you your father was a G man, I understand. What and you grew up around that. How did that work out? I mean, what was that
He
all about?
was, and I always say
Uh,
he's no longer here to defend himself,
yeah.
but I always say he was a Hoover era G-man with all that
Okay.
implies. Um, I remember probably, and my mom outlived him by about 20 years, but on what I think was the last card trip to a restaurant that I took with her, somehow on the way home, the subject of J. Edgar Hoover came up, and I said, Mom, a lot has been uncovered about J. Edgar Hoover that's not particularly complimentary. And she said, I don't want to hear a word against Mr. Hoover from anyone, and that includes you. And that sort of spoke to the kind of, when I
Okay.
say a Hoover era G man,
Yeah.
attitude that prevailed in our household. But yeah, my dad, for years in Niagara Falls, which is where we finally settled when I was about to start fourth grade, he was mainly working the mafia beat for many years on the trail of Stefano Magaddino, who of course owned a funeral home in Niagara Falls, and his family members. And I mean, there were a number of ways that I can think of that having a dad like the dad I had affected me over the years. One of them was there was a restaurant in Niagara Falls that was a well-known Italian restaurant in the Little Italy section of Niagara Falls, and my dad used to kind of hang out there because that's where the mafiosos hung out, and he was trying to keep track of what they were doing. But he also liked the food, and so he would occasionally take our family there. And I distinctly remember this. This guy who I'm about to mention died in 1976. So this would have been in the early 70s sometime. I was probably home from college. He took our whole family to eat at the Como. And as we were leaving, a gentleman, well, nicely dressed gentleman, was coming into the restaurant, and he greeted my dad, like they were old friends. Hi, Jack. How are you doing? My dad said, Oh, Peter, how are you? And we went outside, and I said, Who was that? And my dad said, Oh, that was Peter Magaddino, who was Stefano Magaddino was the kingpin in Western New York, but it was Stefano's son. And I was just struck by the familiarity. I thought, oh, so the guys on the other side of the law don't look that different,
Yeah.
don't present that differently. But that's an anecdote that's always stuck in my mind because of
Cops and robbers often end up in the same pot because they spend so much time doing that dance. You know,
exactly,
yeah,
exactly.
it's exactly. So then you went off into hospital administration for a while and
Oh,
did
wait,
that.
before you did
Yeah.
that, I'm interested
Oh,
in
oh,
how going to Trinity College in
ah,
Dublin turned you away from being an English
Yeah,
professor, because
yeah.
what a great place to have studied.
that's a good question, Catherine. Um, yeah, I got a grant to study modern Irish literature at Trinity College. And when I went there, I still thought I was on track to becoming an English professor. That's what I thought I wanted to do.
Well, why did you want to do that? Because our audience is largely writers, so I think they'd be interested in why you would pursue that and then switched away from it.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I went a ways down that path. I got my master's in English at Purdue right after graduating from undergraduate school. And then I went back to my undergraduate school, Valparaiso University, and taught there for a year in the English department. And then I got this grant to study modern Irish literature, which sounded fantastic to me. I mean, I was interested in modern Irish literature. I was interested in Ireland. So off I went. And I had a wonderful year. Like, in no way did that year sour me on the study of literature. But I had a lot of time to think, and I just decided academia probably won't be a good fit for me. And I was a kid, I was 22, but I thought, when I was at Purdue, I was exposed to a lot of the publish or perish kind of mentality that prevailed in academia, at least back then. And I thought, having to prove myself intellectually over and over again that way didn't sound appealing to me. So I decided to turn away from that route toward becoming an English professor, not at all because of anything negative at Trinity College. That was
Okay.
I mean, everything was paid for. It was an amazing
Wow.
year.
Cool.
This is just a little anecdote you might enjoy. Like, I saw U2 play countless times that year. They were one of the knockaround bands in town. And one time I was eating lunch. I won't go into the details of why, but I was in Galway and I found myself eating lunch with the Edge's parents, his mom and dad. And I said, I've seen your sons play around a lot, including they were in the cafeteria at Trinity last week. And he said, his dad, who was a Welsh man, said, yeah, the boys are home this afternoon banging around in the basement. Who knows if anything will ever come of it? Yeah, that was in 1978.
Yeah.
Fall of 78.
And now they basically own the UK, or could if they
Yeah,
wanted
exactly.
to.
But I always tell people that story. They're always entertained by it. It's just so bizarre at that early stage in their life as a band.
So now you can tell us about the
Yeah.
public
You
the
went to
job
healthcare
you went on
administration
to?
for a while, and
Well, I kind of chose to emphasize this in my book in the very first chapter. And I'm sure a lot of other people have had experiences similar to this, where something odd and seemingly random and underdetermined happens in your life, and it changes everything that happens from that point on. I came back from Ireland, and I remember one day I said to my mom, I don't know, I don't really know what I want to do for the rest of my life. Literally, no idea. And she said, my mom was nothing if not a problem solver and J. Edgar Hoover fan. But she said, well, she was a nurse at the local hospital, and she said, well, have you ever thought of hospital administration? And I said, no, what's that? I'd never heard of it. I had no idea what it was. And she said, well, I don't really know what it is either. But there are two nice looking young fellows down at the hospital. They're always friendly when they greet me in the hallway. Why don't you go down and talk to one of them? And I thought, well, I didn't have anything else going on. So I went down and talked with one of them, and he was a very nice guy. I was impressed with him. And at the end of our hour-long meeting, he said, I'll tell you what you do, Jeff. Go and do your master's at George Washington, which is where he had done his, and then come back and work for me. And it sort of sounded like a job offer. And I didn't have anything else going. So I thought, okay. So I applied to one school. This is the thing that happens for random reasons that changes everything. I applied to one school, George Washington, and I needed not only to get in, despite the fact that I'd never taken a single business course in my life, but I needed to get something approximating a full scholarship. And I thought, this is a long shot, but I'll try. And I did get admitted, and I got a very generous scholarship. So off I went. But at that point in my life, it was George Washington or bust. I mean, I had no other prospects. So I went to George Washington. And for the second half of that degree, we did a residency. And I had friends who went to San Francisco, LA, Boston, all over the country. Of all the places I could have landed, I landed in Columbus, Ohio, at what was then the largest private general hospital in Ohio. And after my residency there, they asked me to stay on, and I kept getting promoted. I don't think for very solid reasons, except I got along with people, and sort of a Peter principle kind of thing. But I got promoted to vice president. But then on December 30th, 1983, two women were murdered in a department I had administrative responsibility for, right off the main corridor of the hospital between 4:30 and 5 on a Friday afternoon. And nobody saw anybody come or go through the single door that led into this tiny medical research lab. And
How were they murdered? What, did someone shoot them, stab them?
No. A totally different kind of murder would have been for a husband who waited in the parking lot with a silencer if he wanted to eliminate his wife. No, they were very brutal murders, each stabbed 20 or more times, one of them hog-tied and her legs hoisted over a table, the other one put in a cold freezer that they used to store tissue samples. So it was a very bloody crime scene. And the police didn't identify any suspects. Nobody saw anybody around the crime scene at the time it had to have occurred. And I was, along with everybody else, freaked out, going to work every day. And I thought I was interacting every day with the person who probably did it, who was the director of the lab, the one who had first come on the crime scene, found the first woman on the floor. And I was dealing with him every day. He would come into my office weeping, talking about the women who were killed. And I'm thinking, I think there's a good chance you did it. But of course, I couldn't say that. But I was thinking it. I was wrong, by the way. But before too long, I decided, well, this hospital administration thing was a noble experiment, but it's not where I'm meant to be. So I applied to OSU, Ohio State, and began work toward my PhD, wanting to become a forensic psychologist and hoping if I did, maybe I would have a better idea of what could have motivated someone like whoever killed these women.
And do you?
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, that story has a very interesting outcome, if I can just briefly describe it. The police didn't arrest anybody. They interviewed the person I thought did it. And there were a few articles in the paper that made me think that they suspected this guy too. But let's see, after 2 years, they still hadn't arrested anyone. And interestingly enough, right after the murders occurred, my parents came through Columbus on their way to Florida and stayed with me. And I said to my dad, I was one of the few people who had keys to the lab, and the scene had been processed, but they hadn't cleaned it up yet. And I said to my dad, do you want to see where the women were murdered? He said, yeah, I would. So I took him over there one evening, and I saw him looking around at the blood splattered all over the walls. And there was, a period of silence. And then he said, you know what? This was made to look like a robbery gone awry, but I don't think that's what it was at all. I think it was a crime committed for totally different reasons by someone who wanted it to look like something different than what it really is. They staged the crime scene. And I thought, well, that's interesting. That was kind of a novel idea to me at the time. I was, still very young. But I pick up the paper one morning about 2.5 years after these murders had occurred, and the headline screams, most tragic FBI shootout in history. 2 agents killed in Miami, 4 agents wounded, 2 suspects killed. And, my dad was an FBI agent, still an active special agent at the time. So I was particularly interested in the story, and I started reading down the first column, and it says the two suspects killed in the shootout with police were Michael J. Platt and William Maddox, formerly of Columbus, Ohio, whose wife died under mysterious circumstances 2.5 years ago. And I thought, William Maddox, he was both he and Patty, I knew Patty, were known to everyone as these very conservative Baptists. And suffice it to say, I had lunch about 8 years ago with the chief homicide cop on that case because I just wanted to pick his brain. Still, officially, it's a cold case. He went down to Florida twice after the shootouts down there looking for the smoking gun in one of these men's apartments that would have definitively tied them to the murders at Riverside. And he didn't find anything. But everyone's assumption is that Bill Maddox and his buddy were behind it. Either one of them did it or they hired a third person to do it. I don't know. But that case really got me thinking in a lot of ways about, crime scene staging. And Catherine, you asked me whether eventually, because of my PhD and the work that I did subsequently, I arrived at any kinds of conclusions about the kind of person who would have committed that murder. And yes, I absolutely did. And I learned how frequently, what a high percentage of murders like that involve a close family member, often a spouse. So, yeah.
Well, since you worked there and you had a key, were you ever a suspect, or did you ever feel like you were? Because they look at everybody.
Exactly.
The circle gets larger as they start.
Interestingly enough, they never interviewed me. In fact, I could never
Really?
out. Then yeah.
That's bizarre.
I'm sorry.
That's bizarre.
Yeah, I think it's bizarre too. I emphasized in the book where I'm talking about that I was up in Western New York, but I was talking to a friend of mine the other day who's reading my book, and he said, I've known you for about 20 years, but I have to admit, while I was reading this, I thought, how would we know for sure that Jeff wasn't involved in this? And I said, well, I emphasized in the book that I was up at my parents' near Niagara Falls. And he said, yeah, but you could easily have driven up there and back between the time of the murders and when you officially returned to Columbus. And I said, yeah, you're right. But the police never interviewed me.
Wow.
Interesting.
I don't know why. I don't know.
So how did you come to know some of the Manson followers? Wasn't that sort of the next thing?
No, that was almost a decade earlier. That's
Oh, okay.
kind of a weird wrinkle in my story because when I was a senior in college, I was so interested in the Manson case. When it happened in summer of '69, I wasn't interested in it at all. I was, looking forward to fall football season and hanging around with my friends and not doing a lot else, not paying attention to the news. But I read a book when I was getting ready for my junior year abroad in Cambridge, England. I read an English edition of Ed Sanders' book, The Family, about the Manson case. And I was fascinated by it, all of the grotesque, grisly details. And then the next year in 1974, Helter Skelter came out. And I read that in a fever, like all night long without putting it down.
Yes.
And one day in my abnormal psychology class, the professor mentioned that he had read Helter Skelter. And I thought, I'm going to hang around after class today and talk with him. And I did. And one of the things I said was, you get the impression from their media portrayals that some of those people who congregated around Manson and were apparently willing to do anything at his behest came from middle-class backgrounds, not so unlike my own. I wonder if they're really automatons of that kind, or if they're more complicated than that. And he said, yeah, I've thought the same thing. Have you ever considered writing them? And I said, writing members of the Manson family? No, that idea had never crossed my mind. But I let it marinate for a while, and I kept coming back to, well, it was my professor who put the idea in my head. It can't be that bizarre. So that began correspondence with quite a few members of the Manson family. I only talk about 4 of them in the book, but there were others as well. And that's how the Manson stuff got started in 1975, and it continued for about 2 years. So quite a few years went by before these murders at Riverside. And the thought of becoming a forensic psychologist had never entered my mind. But I thought, well, murder kind of seems to be following me. There was that whole Manson chapter. And then I end up in this hospital in Columbus, Ohio, and 2 of my employees are murdered. I might as well embrace it. So I decided to do my PhD.
Well, essentially, I love you were talking about you read those books and that it put a hook in you. I read those books. I was in Houston doing my training when Helter Skelter came out, and it blew me away. It absolutely blew me because it read like a novel, but I knew it was true because I knew the story.
Yeah.
So to make a long story short, I came and visited a buddy of mine in L.A., and I'd never been to L.A., and I got in at night, and he had some things going. So the next morning, he says, "It's first day in L.A., what do you want to do?" I said, "Do you know where Benedict Canyon is?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Take me there." He said, "Where are we going?" I said, "Just take me to
Like
Benedict Canyon."
like me.
Exactly. And I got there. He said, and I said, "Now slow down," because I'd never been, but I knew what I was looking for. I said, "Turn left right here, Cielo Drive."
Oh,
And
really?
we went all the way up to the end, and it ended at this chain link gate. And I got out of the car and I walked up to that gate, and I put, you put your hands through chain link. And I'm looking, and Ben said, "Where are we?" I said, "Sharon Tate was murdered right there."
And you probably
And he
spent
said,
a week
"What?" And I said,
looking at that
I
gate.
had to see it. I had to know it was real. But so you did you actually then communicated with Squeaky and with Sandra Good and
Oh
some of
yeah.
them? Or?
Oh yeah. And I mean, I feel like my correspondence with Sandy and Squeaky was interesting. The progression of the letters was interesting. It started out with me figuring, how do I get hold of Squeaky Fromy? By all accounts, she was Manson's second in command, but she wasn't in custody at the time. I had no idea where she was. And then
So she hadn't tried to shoot forward then.
no,
Yeah, that was
she had.
later.
This is March of 1975.
Right.
But I remembered a paragraph in Helter Skelter that said one of the assistant DAs, the office who was prosecuting Manson and everybody else, had developed kind of a friendship with the Manson women who were sitting vigil outside the Hall of Justice during his trial. And I thought, well, this is a long shot, but I'm going to try it. So I wrote a letter to Squeaky and Sandy, put it in an envelope, left the address under their names blank, and then put that envelope in a larger envelope with a letter to Charles Melcher, this assistant district attorney, asking him if he knew where Squeaky and Sandy were, would he please complete the address on their envelope and send it to them? And I thought, this is never going to bear fruit. But he wrote me back immediately and said, yes, I do know where they are. Of course, he didn't tell me their address, but he said, I sent your letter to them 2 days ago. And within a week, Squeaky wrote to me. And the progression that I referred to before, her first letter was like a hippie child. There were hearts drawn and flowers drawn, and she stopped in the middle of the letter to say, "Charlie didn't do it, Jeff. He is it." And then she said, at the ranch, it was all compassion and love and honesty and sharing. And this was all written on floral accented stationery, by the way, with this loopy. I always liken it to middle school girls' handwriting, but I think I could get in trouble for stereotyping that way, but that's what it looked like to me, that sort of very loopy. And as I said, flowers and hearts. And then at the end of the letter, she put a PS and she said, when you write back, tell us a little about yourself and send a picture. And I said to the guy I was living with at the time, these Manson women want a picture of me. That doesn't seem like a good idea. I knew I had to give them my return address because it would be on the envelope. But I said, I don't really want to send them a picture of myself. And he said, well, send one, but make sure it's one that doesn't look at all like you look now, which I thought was sound advice. So I did send them a picture that didn't look anything like I looked then. And
Just don't send them a lock of hair.
Yeah.
I wasn't going to get into that. But then what Sandy Good, her close friend and roommate, they lived in an attic apartment in downtown Sacramento. Sandy sort of took over the correspondence. And at first, she sounded much like Squeaky, very intelligent, articulate, not at all like someone who would be involved in mass murder, even though I knew that these women knew all about the Tate LaBianca murders. They were up to their ears in that, even though they weren't physically involved in committing the murders. But I also knew they were outside prison, of course, and that made me very wary. But Sandy began sounding much like Squeaky, and then there was a progression of maybe 4 letters over 6 weeks. And then she began one letter with a sentence I don't think anyone ever wants to hear from a member of the Manson family. Jeff, we're moving out of the realm of words. I thought words is where I want to stay. I don't want to move out. I don't want to move out of the realm of words. And that was the beginning. And I could tell from that letter, things had changed. That was kind of a watershed. And then on June 30th, she sent me a letter that was just crazy, wanting me to call people who they thought were offending against the environment, wanting me to threaten them. And up until this point, references to the Tate LaBianca murders had been oblique. Now she was saying things like, try to talk to the wives of these executives if you can, and tell them Manson says. And if they say, what? Say, Manson, remember Sharon Tate? And that if they don't follow your demands, a letter of assassins will sweep through their homes and splash blood from room to room. Later in the letter, she talked about people getting their arms cut off. She encouraged me to go out in the woods and kill a hunter and then leave a sign on the trees saying, there are hunters hunting hunters. So I thought, okay, Jeff, you're in way over your head now. You need to figure out some way of extricating yourself from this. So I sent a letter to a good friend of mine who lived in Wisconsin, and I asked her to mail it. But by the way, in the summer of 1975, I was corresponding with Charles Manson, Squeaky Fromme, Tex Watson, Susan Atkins from my parents' address. I was living with them in Western New York. My dad's an FBI agent. And I worked at the post office that summer, so I used to intercept the letters when they came in the morning, which I'm sure was a federal crime of some sort. But I spared my parents the indignity of reaching in their mailbox and pulling a letter out from Charles Manson. But anyway, I sent my friend in Wisconsin a letter so she could mail it from there and get a Wisconsin postmark. And in the letter, I told them I'd left Western New York. I was hitchhiking that summer, didn't have a fixed address. And then 2 months later, the headline, Squeaky Fromme attempts to assassinate President Ford on September 5th, 75. So I thought, well, I got out of that just in time.
Yeah, you could have been right with them on that.
They were clearly trying to recruit me. And the tone of desperation in their letters became clearer and clearer. They kept insisting, Charlie needs a new trial. No one will listen to us. So when she finally attempted to assassinate the president, I can't say I was shocked.
Yeah. Well, a friend of mine who's a PhD psychologist also. He actually back in the 70s, I think, sent Manson, wrote to Manson also out of curiosity, and he sent him an MMPI and asked him to take it. And Manson rewrote the test and sent it back to him.
That sounds like
Isn't
something.
that, yeah, doesn't that, yeah. And so he said, well, I want to publish this. And Manson's attorney said, not a chance. Not a chance
Well, I
you
mean,
publish this.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
It speaks to Manson's desire to control
Everything. Control everything.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mind. The mind. You also had a run-in with Gacy.
I had more than a run-in with Mr. Gacy. I'll tell you how that came about. I was in graduate school. I started graduate school in fall of 1985. And I hadn't yet started. I'll just refer to this chapter quickly. I hadn't yet started when I decided to write to Ted Bundy, who was on death row in Florida, because I knew Bundy had participated with the authors of the book, The Only Living Witness, in this kind of, they offered him the opportunity to talk about the crimes thought to have been committed by Ted Bundy in the third person. Like, how do you think the killer would have behaved and so on? And Bundy did that, agreed to participate in that without, admitting any complicity. And so I had in mind maybe Bundy could help me understand whoever killed these women at the hospital and then disappeared into thin air, which was something Bundy specialized in. And Bundy never wrote me back. And I had told him, if you don't write me back, you'll never hear from me again. I'm not trying to bother you. And then about a year later, he did write me. And this, I mean, Katherine, I know this will resonate with you. But he says basically, I've had your letter for over a year. I've just come upon it recently amongst my papers, was the word he used. And he apologized for taking such an inordinately long time to respond. And then he said, I thought your questions were very searching and thoughtful. At this point, I can only say, this is a guy sitting with 2 death sentences hanging over him in Florida. He says, I've never felt better in my life, physically, mentally, and spiritually. I hope the same can be said for you. And then, and he knows, I know that he's a rover. He's known for his incredible mobility. He would have known from reading my letter that I was well aware of that. So he signs off his letter. Take care, watch yourself, travel light, peace, Ted. And I thought, I didn't know much then, but I thought that is the classic serial killer's tease. He's not going to admit anything, but he thought he was pretty clever. He knew I would get the joke and was apparently entertaining himself. So I had that correspondence with Bundy that didn't go very far in the direction I had hoped it would. And I thought, well, who else could I write to who might be a little more responsive than Bundy? I never wrote Bundy back. So I wrote John Wayne Gacy, someone else who was on death row in Florida, having been convicted of 33 murders of boys and young men. And that began a regular correspondence that lasted for almost exactly 3 years. And I made 2 trips from Columbus to Menard Correctional Facility, where Illinois' death row was, 450 miles each way, 2 times. And I had really no idea. I'd never been in a room before with someone known to have committed murder, even one. I didn't know maximum security prison protocol, none of that. And now I do. And looking back on this, it still seems bizarre to me, but it's the way it happened. I signed in and the guard, we went through all of the checkpoints and waiting rooms and so on. And we finally got to the building that housed what he referred to as the condemned unit. And we got up to big steel door, I guess it was. And he unlocked it with his key. And then he pauses just as I'm about to go through the door. And he says, I'm sure you know why Mr. Gacy is on the condemned unit. I said, I do. And he said, I know you've traveled a long way to be here. You've come from Columbus, Ohio. And I said, that's right. And he said, well, I just want you to know something. Once you go back there, you're going to be on your own. It's against, there'll be a camera in the room where you and Mr. Gacy are, but no one will be on your side of this gate. No corrections officers. You'll be on your own. And, God forbid that something awry would happen back there or that a hostage situation would develop. But if one does, it's against prison policy to negotiate with inmates. So,
So bye-bye.
There won't be anybody back there to help you. So I walked into this situation, thinking, well, that's surprising and bizarre, but I'm not going to turn around and drive to Columbus. I've come all this way. So yeah, I went there, and over the 2 days, that trip, and then 2 days, another trip, spent close to 20 hours with Gacy.
What was he like? How did you find him? I mean, was he overtly manipulative, or was he more engaging, or how did he come off?
Well, I remember the first, not for the evening after my first day with him, I called my wife here in Columbus, and she said the same thing. Well, what was he like? And I said, he's the kind of guy who, if I walked into a bar and he was seated on one of the bar stools and I sat down next to him, before long, I'd find us chit-chatting about sports, my Detroit Tigers, his Chicago Cubs, my Buffalo Bills, his Chicago Bears, and he'd be very engaging. He'd just kind of like a blue collar sort of guy, and he'd be very easy to talk with and disarming. But before too long, I would come to the realization that he had absolutely zero interest in my point of view about anything. He might pause occasionally and say, wait, did you say you're in graduate school? How are your courses going? And I'd start to talk, and then immediately he would hijack the conversation again, just extraordinarily self-absorbed.
Yeah.
So that would have made him stick out.
Yeah.
I mean, why did you want to meet him? That's a long ways to go, and that's a lot of stuff to go through. Why did you want to actually be in the same room with him?
I was still in that mindset that maybe by communicating with some of these repeat killers, I might learn something. And I thought of Gacy, Gacy thought nothing of pontificating as an expert about serial murder, apparently totally oblivious to the irony of claiming he knew nothing about it, had no firsthand experience, but he would pontificate. He would appear on this FBI, they would have these conferences, and Gacy would appear as a guest speaker, and he thought that was fine, But I had the idea in my mind that maybe he would talk about murders the way Bundy had talked with the two authors of The Only Living Witness. And I mean, in a way, he did. He had a lot to say about psychopathy. He had a lot to say about serial murder, even though he claimed that he had never committed it. So I was interested in those things, but I also, I don't know, I was very naive. I was in my first year of graduate school spring of my first year when I began corresponding with him, and then the fall of my second year when I went for my first visit with him. And I think, throughout my life, I've always been interested in odd people. I mean, odd in different ways, outsiders, killers are obviously the most extreme example, but snake handlers, sideshow performers, lifelong interests of mine. So the opportunity, I mean, Gacy invited me to come, and I thought, well, we've been corresponding for 8 months. I'm curious enough to do it. So my wife said goodbye to me and said, "Are you sure this is a good idea?"
Nice knowing you.
I said, "No, I'm not sure. I'm committed to doing it at this point. So hopefully I'll be back in a few days."
Well, from what you said about it, it's easy to understand how these naive young men ended up in the crawl space. I mean, if he had that
Yeah.
gift of gab and that way of talking about stuff, he's older, so he sounds very erudite and professorial, and oh, I'm your buddy. Oh, and by the way, you're going to end up in my crawl space that I know nothing about.
So to imagine how that occurred. And
Yes.
Catherine's written
Yeah.
at length about this subject, including in The Serial Killer's Apprentice, Dean Corll, and
Yes.
how
Yeah.
he was able to disarm these young men.
Absolutely.
And that happens, I mean, Gacy was obvious. Well, I don't know. I mean, Catherine, I'm interested in because I saw you interviewed, and I can't remember. Oh, I know what it was. You were being interviewed with Karen Conti,
Oh, yeah.
and I think you agree. I was just about to say Gacy was a lone operator, but I think you agreed, or tell
Well,
me if I'm wrong.
my co-author had done 10 years of research on the Gacy case, and there clearly are mentions of two people that he himself said were part of the operation. There was a living witness who claimed there was another man in the house, and he described one of those very people.
Yeah,
And that person was linked to the predator in Dallas and Houston.
and that
So
whole network
she did a
of
lot of the research on that. And I know there are people who just absolutely will not tolerate anybody saying that Gacy had other people involved, but we don't know. And he himself said that he did.
I know.
And we know that the other at least two of those three, the DA decided not to really touch. Could have, but decided not to. We don't know why. So,
I mean, they
I think
appeared
there are
as witnesses.
questions.
I know you're talking about Michael Rossi and David Cram,
Yeah,
and they both appeared as witnesses at
yeah,
Gacy's trial. And Sam Amaranti is Gacy's
right.
attorney, doesn't think there are any more murders.
Yeah, but look at, I mean, honestly, really. Yeah, that was his first case
I know
his book was amusing, to say the least. And we don't know. And when somebody claims they do know, absolutely, they can't possibly know. Gacy could have had all kinds of secrets, and he certainly hinted that he did. So I'm willing to stay open to the possibility that there were others involved. And I think my co-author, Tracy Ullman, did a lot of really good research on this.
Well, I'm open to that too, based on whatever I've been able to learn about the Gacy case over the years. I couldn't get Gacy to stop talking about Rossi and Cram. I mean, he was just
Yeah,
obsessed.
yeah.
But he was suggesting they should have been looked at for all of it.
Yeah, but they should have been looked at least more seriously than they were for some of it.
Yeah,
And
you would
they
think.
weren't. They were not even so if you're not going to investigate them, how do you know they weren't involved?
Right. No, I mean, it's an interesting, and the question of whether there are more victims. I think you said you thought there probably were.
But
And
and maybe not in that area, but in other places where Gacy went.
he
Yeah,
traveled a lot.
yeah, he did. He did travel quite a bit.
Yeah, I think both of those are very interesting questions.
Yeah.
If there are others involved and other victims in other places. Yeah.
Well, I mean, it goes that way for Bundy too. Were there others?
Sure.
The Green River Killer. Were there others? I mean, was he confessed for 49 ultimately.
Yeah.
But a
So,
lot of people have said it could be twice that. We just
well,
don't know.
he has said there's probably more. He just couldn't remember.
Yeah, just couldn't remember. Well,
Yeah.
you get your Saturday nights mixed up.
After a few.
After you've had a few, you can't remember. Yeah, it's
Yeah, I mean, you probably don't want to go too far down that path, but
no.
I'm just interested, Catherine, because you're an expert in all of this. I value your opinion. Whenever I've seen interviews with Ridgway, I
Mhm.
think in addition to the fact that he killed all these people, there's something wrong with this
Yeah.
guy.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. He even admitted that he would have killed his son if his son had gotten out of the truck that one day. He's very, but I've talked to his wife, and she said he was like her knight in shining armor. He was far better than her first husband, who was
Damn thing. But doesn't it look, I guess what I'm hinting at is, doesn't it look to you like he's somewhere on the autism spectrum?
maybe so, because he
Could
did
be.
pass a polygraph. There's a lack of emotionality there. He's very low key. That letter he wrote certainly has some issues, shows some issues with him. I think recently he's had a stroke. I think he has had, but before that, yeah, I think there's something up.
I
I don't
just,
Well, I
think
think
he went through any kind of psychiatric evaluations that, really amounted to much. So I couldn't tell you what.
I think Gary summed it up. And one of the investigators asked him, what do you have that we don't, or what are you missing that we have? Why are you so
Yeah,
different? He said, I guess it's that caring
the
thing.
caring thing, right?
And that kind of sums it up, out of the
Yeah.
mouth of babes, if
really does. I mean,
I
that's,
mean, it could be that he's got that brain of a psychopath that doesn't
yes.
make the moral and emotional connections that other people do. But I don't think he got evaluated in terms of a formal diagnosis.
I don't think he did either. The other classic exchange I remember with him was, I don't know if it was an FBI agent or something. I think this was part of a special on him that was on 60 Minutes or something. But he said, well, on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you think you would rank yourself as a serial killer? And he just like flatline said, I think a 10. Like he didn't act like it was an unusual question. Didn't think
Mhm.
it was weird ranking himself on a serial killer scale. He just said, I think a 10.
It didn't register in, some parts of his brain. And
No,
this is
not,
just what I do.
But remember, he thought he was on a mission. He was
Yeah,
helping the
yes,
police. So
absolutely.
it wasn't in his mind a terrible thing that he was doing.
No. Well, tell us a little bit
So I have
about,
one more
yeah,
question for
yeah.
you. What are you doing next? Are you going to write another book, or where do you go from here?
ah, I don't know. I've got some ideas. It wouldn't be a book like this one, though it would probably be a book about my experiences with cultural outliers, maybe not murderers, but I've got some ideas. I've drafted a few chapters, but I don't know. I recently had open heart surgery in December,
Yeah.
and I'm not getting any younger in my 70s, so I don't know. I'll see.
Okay. I was just curious if you would continue in this, since you did mention the death penalty cases. I wondered if you might pursue that.
Probably not in a book. I don't know. I enjoyed writing this though. I'd never attempted this kind of writing at all before. I did a lot of writing in my career, but it was, for court documents and so on. But I really enjoyed the process of writing my first book. So, and I kind of missed that when the pandemic came along. For the first time, really, I disciplined myself to spend 3 or 4 hours a day. And that's when I really got down to the writing part. And I really enjoyed it. So, and you obviously really
Well, you
enjoy
had that English professor background.
it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. So I like to write.
You see, nothing is wasted.
Right.
It all comes back. Whatever you do, it all comes back.
That is,
Well, where can people find the book? I mean, everywhere books are sold, so to speak.
yeah.
Yeah.
And it's very easily available on Amazon. My website is www.jeffreysmalldon.com. There's a free chapter promotion there, and um, I'm trying to think. Well, there's the free chapter promotion, but you can also very easily on the website click on Amazon or Barnes and Noble or the publisher, Black Lion Publishing. So it's very easy to obtain.
Well, when we post this, we will put links to all of that and a picture of the cover and all that, because so people can find it. Um, is there any other tidbits in there that you want to discuss, or you want to make them buy the book and read it all?
No, a few other remarks about Gacy. You had asked Doug, how did he come across? How was it to be with him? Um, there was a profile very shortly before his execution written by Alec Wilkinson. It was a cover story in the New Yorker. And I thought it was a great article. And I thought, this is the person came to know, the one that Wilkinson's describing. And one of the things Wilkinson said in his article was that he took off his watch at one point and put it down because he couldn't bear to watch the minutes ticking away, that Gacy's company was so dreary. He couldn't bear. And it's true, you think, well,
Water torture.
it's true. You think, well, this guy killed 33 people. He's going to be either threatening or, some kind of exciting person to talk to. And he's just so self-centered.
Mhm.
And, all he could talk about was the reasons he couldn't possibly have committed these crimes. And finally, he was talking so long about Michael Rossi and David Graham. I thought, if I don't interrupt him now, he's going to talk about them for the rest of the day. And I had to say, can we stop talking about them? And I think what I shifted to was his sexual orientation, which is something I was interested in hearing him talk about. And then his family, I was interested in him talking about them. But there were times during the near 20 hours I spent with him where time just seemed to be moving so slowly. And I thought, he is boring me half to death here.
Well, I think at the end of the day, the fascinating part about this whole topic and these people
Yeah.
is that how normal they can seem, and how you mentioned that Gacy, you would have sat down at a bar and chatted with him. Now you would have obviously seen signs that the average person wouldn't, so you would have come away with something a little different. The average Joe may sit there and talk football and sports and women and books and whatever, and never get a clue who they were talking to. And to me, I think that is what the reason I had to go to the Manson murder site, because you have to say, is this real? Can this really happen? Can someone like this really do that? And the answer is, yeah.
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 Can I tell you my brief Cielo Drive anecdote, Doug?
Oh, yes, yes.
I'm out in LA. I went with a buddy of mine camping in summer of '76. So it was after I'd read Helter Skelter and Family and corresponded with Manson for about a year. But I had to see it too. My friend had to fly back for work, so I was on my own out there. And I went to Benedict Canyon, and there was no GPS then, but I found my way to Cielo Drive. And
Which there's actually two of them.
I didn't know there were two of them.
Yeah.
No,
One of them has
You
all
went
the
there
numbers.
wrong one.
One of them has all the numbers, but no zeros. And then about 100 yards on up the road, there's another Cielo Drive, and it has the zero numbers. So it's 10, 20, 30, 40, and 50.
And did both of those exist back in the
They
day?
did the day I went, which was 1975, because we turned on the first one, and I said, this isn't right. There's no zeros here. I can't find the right thing. I said, let's go back down. I said, let's go on a little further. And I saw another sign that said Hello Drive. And I said, turn up here. And then it dead ends into that fence. But you got 10, 20, 40, and there's 5 houses on that road. Yeah.
I was so disoriented I didn't even realize there were
Yeah.
two of them.
Yeah. Well, you apparently went to the right one.
Yeah, I did go to the right.
Yeah, right.
And of course, I saw at the foot of the driveway the sign saying "No trespassers,"
Right.
and I was there by myself, and I thought, well, that's interesting, but I've never been that much of a rule follower anyway. So I'm just going to walk up there. And so I walk up to the gate, the one you're describing,
Mhm.
a very familiar sight over that gate.
Yes.
See the side of the garage and the
You can
driveway.
see right up the drag. Yeah. The backyard, the front yard, I guess.
And I was interested in the telephone pole that Tex Watson
Right.
climbed to snip and I'm not sure I had the right one, but the one that I thought was the right one had been cut. So it was a stump, stump that probably came
Hmm.
up above my waist. And I thought, I'm going to get up on top of that stump and take a good photograph right over this gate. So I've got my little Kodak Instamatic camera. This is 1976, a year after Doug's adventure there, and I'm looking up the driveway through this camera, and I see this car coming at me, and I thought, oh crap, I don't know who this is, but it can't be a good thing that I'm up
Could
here
be squeaky.
taking this picture. And I'm sure it was Rudy Altobelli, who is the owner of that property
Right.
and had been. Um, Still was, as far as I know. But I thought, I'm in real trouble now. So I got off the stump and just stood there waiting for him to get to the gate. And he got out of his car and he said, did you see that no trespassing sign at the foot of the yard? And I said, yes, I did. And I said, I'm here from Ohio. I'm interested in the Manson case. I just wanted to take a picture. And he was pretty cool. He said, well, I understand. Okay, but I'm sure you understand why we don't want trespassers up here.
Hmm.
I said, yes, I do. And he said, well, take your pictures and then please leave. And I said, I will. So it ended up being a very amicable encounter, but I thought this can't be good to see a car heading toward the gate from that property.
Yeah.
Well, I remember standing there at that fence and looking back down the road and looking at the thing. And we stayed there for like 10 minutes. And it didn't say much. I was just absorbing the area. And I thought it was night. They parked down the hill. They walked up this street. They got it over this fence. What were they thinking? What were they really, really thinking? Not that this is an adventure and we're going to go have fun like they creepy crawled, they did all those 100 houses or something. This was different. What were they thinking? I guess we'll probably never know because they're not very forthcoming. you know.
No, though, I mean, before her death, Susan Atkins wrote an account. I think her husband, who was an attorney, Harvard educated attorney, helped her with the book. She was very sick before she died, but it was called The Myth of Helter Skelter. And I thought it was probably as close to what happened as
Yeah.
anybody
Yeah.
had written. But yeah, if you watch the Manson characters on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, the movie,
Yeah.
they're
Exactly.
crazy maniacs.
Right.
And particularly the woman who played Susan Atkins.
Yeah.
She,
Exactly.
she's the one who Leonardo DiCaprio torches in the swimming pool at the end.
Yeah. And they could have easily gotten away with it. A few little things put them on the right track, and then Atkins opened her mouth, and that's what brought
Yeah.
the castle down. But yeah, I mean, they were just a sad sack of little hippies that were little nothing, no ne'er do wells living out in the desert, man. And if you'd have seen them, you'd say, "Oh, they're escapees from Haight-Ashbury," and it's okay. Give them a couple of bucks to go buy some food, and let's go somewhere else, But yeah, yeah,
I think one of the bizarre parts about that whole case, looking at it from where we sit now, back in 1969, is that the police didn't link these crimes.
mm-mm.
Even though there's writing in blood on the
Yeah.
walls, it's
Yep.
like,
Yep.
I mean, nowadays, I
Yeah.
think it'd be pretty quick to link them, but it took them a while back then.
Yep. Yeah. Well, Jeff, this has been fantastic. I mean, this has just been so much fun, and I really appreciate you being here.
Talking with both of you, and I
Well, we
appreciate
want you to write another book so we can bring you back and talk about that.
Well, I appreciate the invite, so thanks for having
Well,
me.
thanks for being here. It was a lot of fun. As Catherine, it's always a pleasure to see you, even if it's remotely. So anyway, so that wraps up this show on the Outliers YouTube channel. This has been Criminal Mischief, the art and science of crime fiction. And as you know, we will be back with more shows down the road. So until then, take care.